pushed on the button, it's not.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for joining us here for the summit overall, and we're pleased to have you here to join us for the panel discussion on promoting effective domestic security. I'm Dawn Scalisi. I'm the Government Global Business Director for Thomson Reuters and a retiree of CIA. I'm also the chair of the Domestic Security Council of INSA, and I'm also on the Intelligence Committee of AFCEA. So this is a great opportunity to bring together people from across multiple agencies, industries, and jurisdictions to address a very important topic. I'm joined here today by 4 colleagues, distinguished panelists. They include General Norty Schwartz, U.S. Air Force retired, and the President and the CEO of the Business Executives for National Security. Joshua School, the Executive Assistant Director for the Intelligence Branch at FBI. Rebecca Weiner, the Assistant Commissioner for Intelligence Analysis at the New York Police Department. And David Glowy, the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at DHS. So thanks to all of you for joining us here today. Before I get started, I will let you know kind of how we'll plan to run the panel. So we'll have a discussion up here on stage for about 45 minutes or so, and at about 1:30, we'll go ahead and take questions from the audience, and we'll hope to make it a very interactive session between the panelists and the audience. At any time during our presentations, if you want to go ahead and start writing your questions on the note cards, that would be great. Raise your hands high so our various assistants can see you and gather up your notes, and they will be funneled up to us so that we can start to address your questions before the end of our panel discussion. Another thing is that as you write your questions, if there's one of our panelists in particular that you would like to direct your question to, please make that clear on your cards. We will otherwise just try to determine who's best positioned, and I've made sure everybody knows they can kind of weigh in and add to the discussion as we move along. So turning to the topic at hand, promoting effective domestic security, I think that all of us can agree that when we look at the issues of national security, domestic security, and the intelligence involved in both of those, it's very much intertwined. I think more so now than in any time in kind of my 3 decades in the intelligence world. And I think that's because of the nature of the transnational threats that we are seeing that are manifesting themselves here within the U.S. homeland in both a physical and a virtual sense. I think we can also agree that the threat landscape itself is complex, it's rapidly changing, and whereas there's been much progress between federal, state, and local and the private sector in terms of sharing information and collaborating and better positioning ourselves to be able to address the rapidly changing nature of the threats that we face, we still have room for improvement, and we need to stay on our toes and basically understand in a more proactive way the nature of the threats that we're facing and how we can better position ourselves to defend against them. So in this session, I'm really pleased to be able to be joined by these 4 very distinguished people with long careers in this field so that we can discuss the homeland-related priorities of this administration, how those priorities really translate into intelligence prerogatives that impact the federal, the state, the local, the private sector, and indeed kind of the U.S. public at large, and determine ways in which we can better enhance the kind of broad Homeland Security intelligence enterprise. So to get started, what I'd like to do is to ask a general question to each of our panelists, because I think each one of them will have kind of a different perspective and background to bring to this. So from a domestic security standpoint, what's at the top of your inbox? What are your key priorities? And I think importantly, how may those priorities have shifted of late to what they had been in the past? So General Schwartz, let me turn to you first.
Thanks, Dawn. Much appreciate the opportunity and, of course, to be here with 4 people who are clearly practitioners in this discipline. I'm simply an observer. But I would say that there are 4 key themes, at least from our observations in the work that our organization has done. And that is the need for collaboration, and that is between federal, state, and local entities. And as part of that, trust, teaming, and cross-agency experience is increasingly relevant to performing at the levels that are required. The second theme is how one organizes in terms of the intelligence mission. And that has to do with whether, for example, at the federal level, we have a quarterback for what I would call public safety related intelligence. It's an important notion that needs attention. Third is information sharing. Clearly, there have been lots of commentary on this over the years, to be sure, but it is information sharing top down, federal, state, and local, as well as bottom up, which is essential to effective outcomes. And finally, there is an important need to address analysts, domestic intelligence analysts, career path and stature. These are important assets, and the fact that perhaps they don't have quite the longevity that foreign intelligence counterparts enjoy in the government does not mean that their role is any less significant. Thank you.
Joshua.
I would say our priorities haven't shifted much in the last couple years. Terrorism still reigns supreme. The threat has certainly morphed and altered itself, and I think, with the pressure DoD is placing on ISIS currently, we have grave concern about our homegrown violent extremists. I think the technology aspects for which the terrorism is now applying to their trade is of grave concern, and certainly Junaid Hussain showed us the power of the smartphone in Raqqa. Secondarily, I would say the nation-state threats, both spy and on the cyber front, are of grave concern to us. Chinese foreign investment into the United States is at the top of that list. Economic espionage, certainly other nation-state actors, to include Russia, North Korea, Iran, and their increasing cyber capability and their collaboration gives me great concern. Transnational organized crime and our rising violence rate across the United States is a big problem, as well as the heroin epidemic that's ongoing. So those would be the top priorities that I would see them.
Thank you. Rebecca, what would you add from your standpoint?
So for us, I think the top of our inbox still remains homegrown violent extremism. That's what we've been seeing a lot of over the last 16 years. We expect to continue to see it. Individuals, small groups, semi-autonomous, who are likely inspired by, but probably not formally linked to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and like ISIS. I think it's worth taking a real quick step back and looking over the last 16 years, almost to the day since 9/11. We've seen 2 pretty dramatic trends in New York that I think are replicated nationwide, which inform our sense of where things are going. And one is the increase in tempo, acceleration, and plot disruptions. So we've had 25 public plots disrupted in New York City since 9/11. 9 of those 25 are in the last 3 years. So we've gone from roughly 1 major plot a year from 2001 to 2009 timeframe to about 3 per year in the last 3 years. So that's been pretty dramatic. The second trend that we've seen is a change in the actors who are perpetrating these attack plots that are thankfully mostly getting disrupted. Whereas we saw in the first 8 or 9 years since 9/11 a lot of external Al-Qaeda-linked plots, the shift has really been to homegrown actors. So we've seen over the last couple years, 11 out of 16 plots disrupted since 2009 involving homegrown actors. So those shifts, I think, will be somewhat durable for the next few years to come. And these are individuals who are largely employing unsophisticated tactics, small arms, edged weapons, vehicle ramming, an attempt to create pretty simple explosives against soft targets, your crowded public areas with crowded outflows, Times Square, Madison Square Garden, subways. That's what's kept our focus. I think so far as our priorities, we as a program at NYPD cut our teeth on the homegrown threat long before ISIS turned it into a cottage industry. So that's been pretty static. We have, though, in the wake of a shift in tactics by jihadists, changed the way we try to harden our targets locally. Training, specialized training for over 1,000 new personnel in counterterrorism, heavy weapons, developing new expertise in the cyber realm, picking up on some of these comments about cyber, and focusing on how to mitigate a soft target attack with an unsophisticated weapon. So this has forced us to be somewhat on our toes. I think sort of looking forward about what we expect to continue to change, I see some diversification in the kinds of political violence on the horizon. So of 25 plots that we've seen in the last 16 years, 23 of them have been linked to or inspired by Al-Qaeda ISIS ideology. Since January of 2017, we've had 2 possible outliers that might be harbingers. In March, an individual named James Harris Jackson drove from Baltimore to New York to kill a black man for the media attention that it would receive. So this was actually, he's facing state terrorism charges. This would be the only fatality in New York City since 9/11 on terrorism charges, which would be in the DT, not IT bucket. And the second is an arrest in June of FBI prosecuted in the Southern District, 2 individuals linked to Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization. So just a reminder that it's not all about Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and homegrown threat. We still have other FTOs to worry about.
Thank you. David?
Thanks, Don. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and just share a few insights. I don't differ at all with what Josh said. Actually, we're 100% aligned on the threat vectors as the FBI sees it. I would add a couple other footnotes from my lane. I'm statutorily charged and mandated to share information with the state, local, private sector, and territorial partners, which is a heavy lift because we have to look at classification levels and information sharing. So based on those threat vectors and partnering with the FBI is how do we get that information out for those that need to know. And one of the challenges we're having is that cyber threat. The cyber threat from state and non-state actors that are threatening our critical infrastructure, and also partnering with the private sector and ensuring that they have the right tools and security mechanisms to protect themselves. So they're locking their doors, they're locking their windows, and setting their own burglar alarm. That's a difficult challenge because the cyber threats have exponentially increased on the homeland. And I'd also take one step back, so that's my tactical lens, which I said is very similar to Josh's. Just on my in bucket is aligning the DHS resources. We are approximately 300,000 strong within the Department of Homeland Security, of the biggest federal law enforcement organizations in the United States, including, state and local. Customs and Border Protection is almost 70,000. How do we align those unique assets and resources that collect intelligence at sensitive to classified mechanisms? How do we resolve that to look at complex networks? And how do we tactically interdict those robust networks that are trying to infiltrate the United States or currently occupied in partners with our other federal law enforcement partners? We're going to have to change the structure of DHS. That is currently not in place to do that. And that's going to be moving resources around based on functional threats. Terrorism, transnational organized crime, cyber, foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, and protection of our critical infrastructure. We're going to move into that space. I know Tom Bossert, the Homeland Security Advisor, mentioned it this morning, actually me by name. We're going to do that, but it's going to be meaning we're going to have a new lens, very similar to how the FBI was restructuring after 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security and the law enforcement organization in there are going to have to start restructuring and looking at how they view the threat vectors in a more sophisticated environment that's emanating outside of the United States.
Thank you very much. You know, one thing that probably has not been discussed in any great detail at these past summits is the whole issue of domestic terrorism. And Becca, you mentioned it just a bit in terms of one of the attacks that took place not too long ago in New York. And certainly as the clashes in Charlottesville showed us, we do have a range of groups within the United States who advocate for and perpetrate violence against one another. And these groups have vastly different ideologies at times and vastly different ways in which they are perpetrating and advocating violence. And so some have questioned whether or not we've kind of taken our eye off the ball, and have we paid enough attention to the threat from a range of domestic groups within the United States, and what additional action and collaboration might be needed to be able to address hate groups in a more proactive way. So Josh, if you don't mind, I will turn to you first to see the FBI's view on this. And Rebecca, you may have some additional comments you might want to make from the standpoint of NYPD's experience.
So that's a fair question, Dawn. Our domestic terrorism threat is addressed through our Joint Terrorism Task Force, and we spent some time talking before we got up here about how that is comprised of other federal agencies, state and locals, to really bring the totality of the resources to bear on a terrorism threat writ large. The balance that we always have to keep in mind is, our constitutional rights to free speech, but although that has a limit on it in the sense that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, and where does that line cross? So I think that we are effectively addressing the threat writ large. I think there's always room for improvement in information sharing and making sure that we're appropriately conveying how we're seeing the threat. And then keep in mind that there are certain statutory laws that allow us to prosecute international terrorism that is not replicated on the domestic terrorism side. We mostly use civil rights and hate crimes in the domestic terrorism arena, where we have a material support statute in the international terrorism. But I think that, getting to what General Schwartz said, I think that looking at how we can embrace technology to better move information across the interagency is definitely something that's in the forefront of my mind, and I'm sure it's in the forefront of the minds of my colleagues, which would actually enhance our ability to better convey the threat information as we see it, whether it's from the FBI, NYPD, DHS, or a host of other IC and law enforcement agencies out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And just to pick up on that, I think the resources that we've invested in our counterterrorism program on the IT side are agile enough to be deployed to counter whatever ideological valence a threat may have. Ultimately, we are responsive to the leads that we're getting. So thus far, that has not been nearly as large a priority for New York domestic terrorism. As I mentioned, it is striking that we did have this one incident. I do think that we could expect nationwide some degree of an increase on that front, and there for us, really, the game is going to be collaboration, information sharing, making sure that we understand the threat as it's changing as best we can, and that's where the role of intelligence really comes into play. So we will be working very closely with our counterparts nationwide to make sure that we're at the top of the game as much as we can be.
Yeah, I would just add a comment that our members, and these are largely business entities and individuals who run businesses, seem to be less concerned about identifying the motivation of the actor, i.e. the ideologies which you have talked about, but more interested in the modalities of those actors and how one might intervene in order to defend a business entity in a cyber context, or certainly physical defense in others. I think that's an interesting sort of thing that management needs to pay attention to, is the amount of emphasis on and focus on motivation versus tactics and techniques that one can defend against.
So if I can, I just want to back up on one of the things I should have added is we're concerned about anybody looking to perpetrate violence, whether it is a international terrorism subject, as I'm sure my colleagues are, right? A gang member, a lone actor. We are concerned across, and we use the tools, which again goes back to the various task forces we enjoy, of being able to leverage all the tools available to bringing those task forces together, the partnerships that we have, not only have today, but are growing as we, over the last 16 years or so, and will continue to grow. I think to General Schwartz's comment is we do need to understand some of the ideological motivations to better get in front of some of these threats, and getting the information flow from our state and local partners, from the IC, and making sure that we are sharing a vision against all threats of violence is critical to us remaining ahead of that threat.
And just to add, lastly, the modalities are very similar, right? So I think that's an important point, is that these sort of expertise areas are ultimately quite fungible because people are employing the same tactics. So the same sort of strategies that you're using to counter them are going to be hopefully effective against whatever threat we're faced with.
I would want to add one footnote. The challenges of domestic terrorism is, it's a fine line before they cross over to that radical violent act against person or property and a freedom of speech, because they're not associated with international terrorism. So it's a challenge for myself and Josh on the federal side of sharing, of looking at those threat vectors and before they cross that line. And sometimes there's not a lot of notice and not a lot of triggers that lead up to it. So it's really that partnership with our state and local and private sector to identify those potential not vulnerabilities, but potential those violent acts, and try to off-road those individuals, or off-lane those individuals before they hit that trigger. And that's really where, starting to look at how we have those violent extremist programs in the communities to identify at-risk individuals that may be going down a radicalization path that would commit a violent act against person or property.
David, I'm going to send the next question your way, kind of given the broad mandate that you have to work across kind of federal, state, and local lines, and that is, one of the areas of my concern in my intelligence community background was the fact that, I worried at times that we were not leveraging non-traditional partners for the intelligence community as best we could. And when I say non-traditional, I mean other federal agencies outside of the IC, state and local partners, private sector partners. Be curious about your position now in terms of how strong we are in that regard today, and what new advancements we need to make so that we can work together better against common threats.
Thanks, Don. Good question. I think there's a couple different buckets there as far as how we're engaging the private sector and in what threat vectors we're trying to address with them. It could be transnational criminal organizations, it could be with a money motivation, or it could be cyber actors that are looking to attack critical infrastructure from a domestic terrorism ideology or an international terrorism ideology. And then also we have leveraging our state and local and private sector partners at the local level, and how do we fuse that information. So I just got back from a trip. I was out in Guam and Hawaii. Obviously there's a North Korea threat on the homeland, I think we're all painfully aware of. But during my trip out there, I visited 2 fusion centers. And if you haven't heard the term, if you've seen one fusion center, you've seen one fusion center. What I'm saying is there's no standardization among our fusion centers. And I was very frustrated very quickly between the two, and I won't mention which one was leveraged, which I would argue is a little bit more where I would come from, is a standardized business and enterprise process. And I'm not saying I'm going to dictate how the state's going to run a fusion center, but there's some basic job functions that intelligence organizations must have: collection management officer, all source domain awareness, a national intelligence collection officer, a reports officer, things that must be in a bucket and filled. It's pretty much standardized like what Josh runs in the DI at the FBI, a FIG model, Field Intelligence Group model. So for us to leverage what Don talks about, I have to have an enterprise approach, also shared services with other federal, state, and local private sector partners on how to attack those problems. I don't have that today, being very candid. I have one intelligence officer per fusion center in general. That's not going to cut it. So what I need to do, or I'm charging my folks to do, is building an enterprise business model approach to how we're going to conduct business, how we're going to collect it. I talked to the general when I was leading up to my confirmation testimony, and this is one of the things we really touched on, and I lasered it, and Ben's was excellent on doing some reports on it in this past on DHS. To me, that's going to be the top priority, is how do we leverage that, how do we create an enterprise approach, and how do we get down to the lowest common denominator to get that intelligence out.
Thank you. Joshua?
Sure, if I might. On the upside, the fusion centers and FBI are working better today than they ever have, and about a third of the fusion centers are co-located with our intelligence apparatus across the United States, which is a really good progress for both DHS and FBI. On the private sector front, the DHS and FBI run a joint venture called DSAC, Domestic Security Alliance Council. And that is a mechanism for which we can get feedback from our private sector partners on the threats that are most impacting them. We've gone on a recent discussions I've had at a high level in the private sector with the DHS is understanding those things that are most impacting our private sector to make sure that we have in the government that resonates with us on where their businesses are, so that we can also be on the lookout for those nation-state actors who are looking to steal our international or our IP. And in that vein, 80% of what's in our nation-state actors are looking to steal from us is in the private sector. So to Dave's point, making sure that we've armed them with all the information they need to harden themselves against those threats coming from nation-state actors. Frankly, economic security is national security. And so if we have to figure out a way to better talk to each other. I think that relationship is growing, but I think there's room to continue to have better dialogue with our private sector partners.
General Swartz, actually, in that regard, Ben's really has been kind of at the forefront of trying to push good working private-public partnerships to address a whole range of threats. What are kind of the key things that Ben's has advocated for in terms of improving that range of relationships?
I think the key thing is the notion of horizontal integration. This is something which modern businesses have undertaken to great success, and that is bringing in all the relevant players and those who have interests. When we were talking earlier about, quote, non-standard partners, that might involve mental health professionals, it might involve human relations experts, it clearly involves faith and civic leaders and so on. But it also includes the business interests, as you indicated, Josh. And as I suggested, I think the key thing from the business point of view is being aware and trying to capture the risk involved in the threat vector or threat vectors. Because very few businesses, if any, can afford to zero out all the risks that they face. And so one must act to prioritize. And the sense that our business partners get from those professionals on the government side to help them calibrate risk is vital. And that's the key thing in my view.
Let me turn to the issue of immigration, because I think when you talk about domestic security, you also have to take into account the need for border security as well. I'd like to turn first to David from DHS to be able to address kind of what's at the top of your plate in terms of kind of your key priorities and challenges from an intelligence perspective. And then Rebecca, New York obviously doesn't face some of the same challenges as some of our southwest border states do, but you do face the challenge of having many individuals who have immigrated, sometimes illegally, into the United States that have taken up residence within New York. You're dealing with them as part of your citizenry that you're dealing with. What kind of challenges from a police and intelligence standpoint do you deal with from that standpoint? So let me start with David from kind of the broad DHS perspective, and then Rebecca to kind of provide us more of that state and local flavor of the challenges.
Sure. So one of the president's key components of his executive order on some of the immigration issues was the extreme vetting, the term extreme vetting, a little bit overused, but how we collect and we resolve big data to identify bad actors, nefarious actors trying to come in the United States. They may be showing up at a border, like right at a border, saying I want to enter, or unlawfully or lawfully, or they may be going through our visa process or refugee process. So creating an infrastructure among relatively, and it still exists, silos in the law enforcement, in the intelligence community, in the Department of Defense, and the private sector organizations, so that information is fused. We're able to resolve data in it and to find unknown, nefarious, bad people trying to come in the United States. That is our top priority in the homeland. It was the top priority under former Secretary Kelly, and it is my top priority. We're in the process right now. We're the co-leads in the Department of Homeland Security. I'm actually one of the co-leads chairing it, is looking at our data systems and what our vulnerabilities are. And I would say one thing, too, is we're focused a lot on terrorism, but I would pivot and say the threat vectors have no functional boundaries. A transnational criminal organization could be a terrorist organization or a foreign intelligence organization. And as we've learned, the Bureau has learned, as a former FBI agent, I saw it, that those nodes and those functional threats can be blurred. So having that information and data sharing so we can find those unknown threat vectors is critical to how we're addressing the immigration threats on the homeland.
So yeah, this is obviously a very different issue from the state and local law enforcement perspective. So certainly NYPD's job is to protect the city from all sorts of threats and crimes, particularly crimes of violence. We rely very heavily on the communities that we police in order to do so. So it's imperative that we maintain the trust and the collaboration of those communities and that people feel comfortable surfacing leads to us. That's the only way for us to do our job. So again, we're somewhat blind as to the origin of the violence or the threat that we are faced with, blind in the sense of preference for how to deal with it. But we need to make sure that those lines of communication are open and that people feel comfortable surfacing issues for us.
Good, thank you.
From the business point of view, I think it boils down to making employee vetting as simple and cost-effective as possible. And data sharing is key to that.
To make sure that we're addressing domestic security as broadly, as holistically as we can, what I'd like to do is to ask each of you in turn if there are other comments that you would like to make on domestic security threats that are top of mind for you that may kind of go beyond terrorism to include perhaps cyber threats and their impact on critical infrastructure, espionage, insider threat, the vulnerability of our supply chains. There may be other topics I have not mentioned, but wanted to give you the opportunity if there are key domestic security issues that you're grappling with now and would like to highlight for the audience, would love to hear that. So, General, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll begin with supply chain. Clearly, there are a question for this audience is, are you comfortable with the fact that there is not a truly high-volume facility in the United States for making microchips? A trusted foundry, if you will, is the term of art. That is a concern from a national security point of view, and there are other disciplines where this also exists. And so this is actually an industrial-based question for the federal government, which is how does one assure that for specific national security applications that the components of any piece of equipment are trustworthy? And at the moment, especially on the chip side, that is not the case.
And if I may, I'm actually going to skip down to David next, only because I know that your time is growing a little bit short with us today. Then we'll work our way back down the table.
Sure. I think Josh touched on it earlier, is the economic espionage impact to the U.S. interest and the U.S. homeland. Our foreign adversaries don't have any rules. They don't have a U.S. statutory book that guides how they can collect information or intelligence. They don't have attorney general guidelines that how we conduct investigations or collection. When we have our foreign adversaries that are trying to influence U.S. trade and financial policy and or impact our economy for their own betterment, we are in a very difficult situation with that. Because of the sophistication of these foreign networks that are trying to impact our economy, we have to have a sophisticated countermeasures to counter that. And that's difficult because we're talking about trade, finance, and economic space. It's a very nuanced specialty skill as a collector, and it's a nuanced specialty skill on how to analyze the impacts of that. And that's really going to be where we have to have that expertise in the private sector and in the government on how to address those vulnerabilities and the impact to the U.S.
I would say an echo for cyber threat from our perspective is another one on the top of our bucket list. So we view ourselves and our response capabilities as part of the critical infrastructure of New York City. So we've got about 30,000 odd 911 calls daily in New York City. Imagine the impact that taking down 911 would have on the city, or undermining our patrol response capabilities. So that's an area where I think we've got a lot of educating of ourselves and our capabilities to do, working very closely with our federal and our private sector and other local partners. And just to come back really quickly to the information sharing and collaboration point from earlier, that's something where we've been the tremendous beneficiaries of sustained information sharing and collaboration from federal partners. So that has been, I think, a tremendous success story from our perspective as state and local government over the last several years. I have analysts from FBI, from DHS, that work directly with me daily on issues to make sure that there is no air gap between what they're seeing, what we're seeing, and how we need to work on it together collectively. Also reaching out to the private sector, we've got a program called NYPD Shield that currently has about 20,000 members across the private sector. So this is an arena where those partnerships really need to be leveraged and are being leveraged, but there's always room for more in that direction.
So there's a host of threats that continue to occupy us. I mean, starting with cyber, we have nation-state actors. Whether you go back to the Sony attack by North Korea, you have Iran incursions, Russian incursions, Chinese cyber actors, all of which are using the easiest method to get at businesses, right? That's what the ransomware is on a huge upswing for businesses. Second only is business email compromise, all looking to steal intellectual property rights. In one case, in some cases, just straight money. In other cases, just looking to create havoc within our economy. Those are very concerning, and we have to partner with our private sector to have a shared vision on that threat, that make sure that the message that us in government, whether it's DHS or the FBI or frankly some of our state and local partners, that it is resonating, that they understand and are seeing the threat as gravely as we are, and protecting themselves. Going back to an initial statement of our economic security is national security, we have to make sure that that partnership is strong in the private industry. Insider threat, both inside the government as well as inside of our private sector partners, is a huge concern. Frankly, the rising violence rate that I touched on earlier in our transnational organized criminal threat is a big priority for the FBI and as well as our partners. And then there's an ongoing heroin epidemic that's ravaging our country right now. And I think New York Times put out an article not too long ago that talked about the death rate and where it stands compared to some of our other benchmarks, whether it was auto deaths or HIV deaths, and how the heroin and fentanyl deaths are topping that at this juncture. So those are all major concerns for us.
Okay. So before he departs, and his answer may be short, but Mr. Glaoui, as the department's chief intelligence officer, and you're working, coordinating, and collaborating across all the intelligence elements of DHS, do you have the needed authorities to do so? And what are the obstacles to sharing and collaboration within the department?
So I do believe I have the needed authorities, legal authorities to do that. What we don't have currently in place is the business enterprise to give tactical intelligence to the components within DHS, meaning ICE, CBP, NYPD. Coast Guard already has an IC capability. So as the only organization charged to integrate IC data with the DHS components, if you've got a foreign threat that's emanating in a foreign country that's approaching U.S. Customs and Border Protection port of entry or between the ports, I need to have tactical level resolution to pass that information to the last line of interdiction, which is going to be usually a U.S. Customs and Border Protection agent, Border Patrol, Air and Marine agent, or a OFO field officer at a point of entry. Because once it gets by DHS on the border, on a land border, or marine border, or air border, it becomes an FBI problem. So having that tactical resolution in an enterprise to go after it is going to be a critical component to us to integrating the capabilities of the intelligence community. And we're not there today, being very candid.
Thank you. So taking some additional questions from the audience. Thank you very much, Dave. Have a question for Mr. School. Can you describe how Kremlin-backed collection and influence efforts have changed of late? And what can the government be doing better to address foreign-directed collection and influence activities against the U.S.
I want to make sure I heard that right. Can you,
How have, especially Kremlin-backed collection and
Kremlin.
influence efforts changed of late? And how can the government do a better job of being able to address such foreign-directed activities?
Okay. I don't know that their collection zeal has changed as of late. I think the Russians have always looked to, to conduct operations against the United States. So I'm not sure that, and hopefully I'm answering this person's questions, I'm not sure that they have changed. I think what has changed is our threat landscape. The cyber modality, the internet, the ability to move information at the speed of technology, that is what has changed mostly. I think, and for us to continue to address that threat effectively, I think we do address the threat effectively. I think there's always room for improvement. And I think some of that has to rest with our ability, as we've already discussed, in moving information at the speed of technology, but also looking at those authorities for which we currently have and making sure that we maintain those authorities, such as 702, that there's a clean reauthorization for us to conduct 702 that is important, not only in the terrorism threat, but also in the cyber and in the counterintelligence threat. It's a very important tool for which the interagency relies on very heavily. And that is critical to us being able to maintain our ability to see beyond the horizon and protecting the homeland.
General, I'll direct this question to you, but others may have a position on it as well with regard to the CFIUS process. And how effective is it at present in terms of protecting the U.S. economy for any undue foreign influence and control? And I'll add, but also taking advantage of investments from overseas that could help grow our economy. And how could we make the CFIUS process more effective for us?
My experience with CFIUS is not terribly positive. It is a bureaucratic process. There are institutional interests that operate, and the question really is, is the economic priority the prime imperative, or is the security priority the prime imperative? And I acknowledge it's not a simple thing to broker those two. But I do think that the CFIUS process, like so many things, can be streamlined and can be more transparent. And certainly, at least in my experience, that's what executives in the major corporations would expect. That just as if they are doing an M&A process, which has to have certain amount of transparency and predictability, the CFIUS process should share that in equal quality.
I would like to, first of all, I think as it stands right now, CFIUS is still a voluntary process, right? And so that presents a certain amount of challenge when you're talking about a nation-state actor looking to have foreign investment to their benefit inside the United States. And I think that's something that we need to do a better job of weighing, is that their foreign investment inside the United States, is that really for the benefit of the United States or for the benefit of a nation that presents a threat to us? So whether you look at the race on technology right now, I don't believe that China's interest in investing in our technology sector is for the betterment of the United States. I believe it is for the betterment of China, and how in that economic race we cannot afford to lose. So I think that is one portion of CFIUS that we probably need to take a look at. I don't disagree that everything can be streamlined, and we should look at for methods to do that. But I think it needs to take a more aggressive approach in how we look at our foreign investment in the United States.
And I should clarify that my comment is sort of equally aimed at both the denials and the approvals. Because the case in point for my earlier comment is, as you know, the one trusted microchip foundry in the country was acquired by a foreign entity, and one has to question the wisdom of that, whether this was an economically viable business or not.
Becca, I will direct the next question to you, but Joshua, no doubt you'll have some comments you'll want to make as well. 10 years from now, what success do you hope to be able to point to in predicting lone wolf attacks, and how do we get from here to there to be more predictive in our capabilities?
Well, I think there are no news would be the best news of all. If 10 years from now we've been able to move along without a successful terrorist attack in New York City. Predictive policing is an area that a lot of people have talked about, leveraging technology to have a better sense of not just terrorism, but where crime is going to be coming from, taking multiple inputs from weather to every other sort of data source you could imagine, to say we expect there to be this kind of crime spike in this arena. I am, generally speaking, somewhat skeptical of technology to be able to do that for us. I think we're best served by using our brains and our experience, and obviously the tools of the trade to help us out. But I think that's a hard one. I think what we've seen is a tremendous evolution in threat on the terrorism side, as well as in the crime side. The fentanyl spike is a really good example of that, right? That's an area where narcotics, counter-narcotics, a pretty traditional field of expertise for law enforcement, and yet we're confronting this pretty dramatic increase in deaths due to a new narcotic substance. So I think that we would feel pretty happy if we can keep crime at its current levels, which are tremendously low, keep terrorism at bay. If we have 1 to 0 people who are killed at the hands of terrorists over the next 16 years, the way we have in the last, I would feel very happy.
Thank you.
I think Rebecca hit it best. I think we need to, and many of us have talked about this, continue to embrace and leverage technology. You know, it's being used for good and, frankly, for evil, and so we need to make sure that we're on the forefront of that. I think it's hard to predict what's in anyone's mind, and many of our homegrown violent extremists have decided when they've been disrupted that that was the day they were going to act, and trying to get in front of that will be something that not just the FBI, but our partners, our state and locals, our other federal will continue to strive to do. But I think as important, and I think you touched on this a little bit, is we need to improve our community relations. Our men and women in law enforcement do everything they possibly can to protect the citizenry that they've sworn to protect. And I think we need to continue to embrace the community in that regard in order to make sure that we are getting those tips and leads that we are accustomed to getting, and that we don't have an erosion in our relationship with the community. So I think those two things combined in a concerted effort on the community front with an embracing of technology should enhance our ability to better understand the threat that we face, whether it's in gangs, drugs, terrorism, cyber actors.
General, Mr. Bossert this morning emphasized integrating mission and function across boundaries. What examples can you point to about very effective joint assignments between industry and government? And how can we better improve that kind of collaboration and job sharing between the two sides so that we can collaborate more effectively going forward?
It's not only a public-private, it's a public-public issue as well. And the fact, of course, we had an example here where David had experience in the FBI and, of course, now is in DHS. But I think the key thing here is having leadership and management on either side who has professional development as a top-of-inbox issue, and recognizing that today one needs, and this is true for intelligence analysts as well, that one needs to have exposure to a broader array of methodologies and practices than one might experience in a single agency in a single stovepipe. And so exchanges and internships and things of that nature, which are a cost of business, but a worthwhile one, you know, is clearly something that can help fulfill this need for people to be bigger than where they came from. You cannot have that occur unless one experiences a broader opportunity. I'd be interested, both from Rebecca and Josh, whether they had opportunities in their careers to be outside the FBI, to be outside the NYPD envelope. I know in my case, I certainly spent a fair amount of time outside my Air Force home plate.
Yeah, no, I've been extraordinarily privileged in my career at NYPD. I spent some time with the National Intelligence Council, which was a very eye-opening experience, moving from very tactical work, which we do up in New York, to very strategic, big-picture analysis. That was tremendously enlarging and empowering for me professionally. And I was very taken that you mentioned in your beginning of your remarks, General, the need for professional development for analyst cadre, because that's something I think that FBI has done great work expanding the mission of analysts at the Bureau. We've really prioritized that at NYPD. So the civilianization of paramilitary organizations is something that has been complicated, taken some time to get sort of everybody used to it. It's amazing how powerful it is when you've got the close collaboration inside an agency of an analytic cadre and an operational cadre who have disparate levels and lanes of expertise that are working hand in glove together. So I think that that is absolutely something that we need to continue to do. In DC, it's much more preaching to the choir, but in local law enforcement, that's an area where I think that there's a lot of room for expansion in terms of analytic tradecraft development.
And let me preempt Josh for just a second and recognize something the FBI has done, which at least we think was terrific. Prior leadership decided that the prior arrangements at the basic school at Quantico for FBI agents and FBI support personnel had traditionally been on two independent tracks. And the FBI decided that if you're going to have an intelligence-driven law enforcement organization, that the agents and the intelligence cadre need to begin their training together. And they do now. This is a new phenomenon down at Quantico, and it's an example of something which truly is changing the culture, and one should recognize and celebrate that.
Okay.
Thank you, General. Thanks for the plug.
An unpaid.
Unpaid advertisement, okay. Very good. Joshua, let me start with you. I think, Rebecca, you'll have a good corollary to this question. But starting with the Bureau, how do you currently provide state, local, and other non-intelligence community partners with useful and actionable threat information when the personnel in those organizations may not be cleared or the facilities may not have access to classified networks?
That is a great question. So when it comes to threat information, we work extremely hard to make sure that those that would be victimized, whether it's on the cyber front, the counterintelligence front, or certainly in the terrorism arena, we work hard to make sure that we can get that to a level for which the recipient of the information, A, understands the gravity of the threat, and B, is positioning themselves to conduct some sort of defensive operation. And you could talk about that in a lot of different threat vectors. So it doesn't always have to be a piece of paper for which the recipient has to hold on to. Sometimes, we will convey the information and certainly not reveal sources and methods of the information, which leads to the high level of classification. And other times we provide them, frankly, a one-time read-in so that there could be an action item. In today's world, especially in the terrorism arena, many of our state and local counterparts have gotten clearances so that they can understand the gravity of the terrorism threat. We have some in the private sector that have clearances so that they can better protect the industries for which they represent. And so that is how we've tackled it over the last several years. And I think it's going well, but it obviously can go better.
So Rebecca, I think from your standpoint, you deal with sensitive information on a regular daily basis, but many of those that you may turn to at NYPD who are going to act upon the information that you provide don't have clearances. So if you could kind of provide your perspective on how that works, how well it works, any kind of lessons learned that you have developed along the way.
That is a challenge for us, certainly. Obviously, the executive cadre and those who are working sensitive counterterrorism issues are cleared. The patrol officers on the street are not. So those who will ultimately have to operationalize some of the insights that we are learning from our own investigative efforts as well as those of our partners are not in a position to have access to the information. For all of those of you who are in the OSINT world, I think that there is a tremendous amount of information out there that is public, that is open, that is unclassified, and we have leveraged it heavily. So whenever we have a chance to explore new abilities to understand what's in the public domain, we take that opportunity, and I think sometimes in the world of only existing in classified information channels, sometimes people forget how much is out there in the public. So that's one way we've tried to overcome in general that issue, but it remains an issue.
So Jenna, perhaps you could provide your perspective on how well served the private sector believes it is currently to get the information that it needs to act upon and how it receives and can work with that information.
There are a number of avenues for that to occur. The ISACs certainly are primary among them. But I think the reality is this is all based on trust. And trusting relationships as they evolve mean that information, regardless of how sensitive, can be shared in a prudential way that, as you suggest, allows people to understand the gravity of the threat as well as how one might take defensive action to mitigate that threat. That's exactly the right formula. I might just also mention, Dawn, that one of the things that your organization, INSIS, surely should opine on has to do with the clearance process itself. You know, it is frustrating when you have a process, in my case, on a renewal, for example, that required vetting that went back to my childhood. Now, I've carried a clearance for quite a while, and you know, re-verifying that I was born on 42 Park Street, you know, was legitimate at one time, but probably in my 60s might not be. My point here is that there is an effort underway to move away from sort of historically based clearance processes to something which is more current, which involves data, which involves observing current behavior in a variety of ways, in a way that's much more likely to preserve the national security. And so I certainly would commend those who are trying to move the process away from its traditional backward-looking perspective to one which is much more current and perhaps forward-looking in the future.
Very good, thank you. Now, we've talked a lot about collaboration across jurisdictions and information sharing, all in a very positive sense. But we do have an intriguing question about whether increased collaboration, increased information sharing can actually raise the risk of insider threat. So I will throw that open to see who might want to address that. I'm looking at you.
I'll start. So I don't know that increased information sharing is the right answer, right? I think sharing the right information is the right answer. So I think we already have a volume problem across the IC, across the interagency, and so having an understanding, both whether it's our IC colleagues, the state and local partnerships, or frankly our private sector partnerships, to understand what is of most value to them, so that we can quickly get to that information that is going to be most impactful, and we're not guessing at what might an industry.
Right.
Absolutely.
Action,
right, and relevant. So I think that is certainly something that we need to continue to refine. And I think on the state and local front, at least from my perspective, we're in a very good spot, and we have very healthy conversations. On the private sector, I think there are good conversations going on that should be going to great conversations here over time, and understanding the different threats that we've already discussed today. As far as the insider threat goes, I think the general touched on some of that, is making sure that we have a robust process in place, whether it's internal to the FBI or other components out there, that we have a more complete understanding than just a background investigation. So that's.
It's an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, the more you provide access to information, the less you can be sure that you are keeping tabs on it and that you have control of where it's going. On the other hand, it's just as likely that increased information sharing would help you identify insider threat, right? So it's sort of hard to mete it out in hypotheticals, but.
Okay. Josh, this one is for you. The FBI stopped publishing terrorism in the United States in the mid-2000s. Is there any thought to bringing back this useful public document?
Not until right now. I actually don't have a good answer on that. So it's good that somebody out there likes it. I would have to probably get a little bit more information on how widely it was distributed and how many folks actually it resonated with. I'm not opposed to sharing information, obviously, on the threat vectors with the public. I'm just not sure how many people outside of the one person that wrote the question actually wanted it. It seems to be a widely covered aspects in social media and open source reporting, news. So
Okay.
I don't. I'll find out.
All right. Okay. I think this question is kind of equally relevant on the federal side as well as on the state and local side. And that is, historically, law enforcement has been somewhat resistant to sharing information to include with the intelligence community and with others due to the possible compromise of prosecutorial evidence. How can we satisfy the demand for information sharing while ensuring that the information that's needed to stop a threat is provided in such a way to not sacrifice after the act prosecution? I may have twisted the wording there just a little bit, but kind of law enforcement, intelligence, information sharing. What can we do to ensure it's done correctly without jeopardizing prosecutions, while also making sure the right people get to the information in time?
You want me to go first?
If you'd like to go first, sure, and then Rebecca?
For it.
Okay. I think that's a historical viewpoint that I don't find accurate in today's world. I think that we keep both equities relevant. We, over the last, I would say, really 10 years, have really made a concerted effort, at least from the FBI, making sure that we are sharing relevant threat information with state and local partners, but also the intelligence community, so that there could be a comprehensive understanding of the threat, not just domestically, but how it ties in abroad. And I think we've really grown in that way over probably the last decade. So I think we're able to do that and effectively protect what we would want to do to disrupt in the homeland. So that's how I view it. If there's obviously whoever wrote that, if there's a suggested way or a viewpoint that it is alternative to that, I'd be interested. But I think we do it pretty well.
I would agree. I think that there are certainly different prerogatives in the intelligence collection realm and in the law enforcement prosecutorial realm, but they're not mutually exclusive, and in fact, they enhance one another. And just as we've sort of plugged the OSINT world, I think prosecutions themselves are a tremendous treasure trove of intelligence that often are not mined adequately for that purpose. So I think that the information flow goes in both directions, even though they have ultimately slightly different goals at their end.
On that point, I don't think it's just the prosecution. I think it's the entirety of the judicial process,
Yes.
right? So I think the question was very much focused on disruption, when it's really the totality of a law enforcement action that is governed by that question. And we do a great job of sharing threat information when uncovered in a search warrant or other collection, just like we would as a member of the IC in just a pure intelligence realm. So, and I think we do it pretty well.
So relevant to so many of the concerns that we've talked about this afternoon is really the need for practices and solutions that are founded in civil liberties, free speech, and to the extent possible, transparency in order to foster trust with the public. But you have access to so much information on individuals and organizations, some of those for example, through social media, at a time where we probably don't have all the policies in order to fully understand how we can best take advantage of that without sacrificing others' rights. So I guess the question is technology outpacing relevant law and policies currently to be able to adequately access the information that we can to be able to address threats more proactively? Do you face any challenges in that regard? And General, let me start with you actually from the standpoint of working so much with the private sector and to hearing kind of their concerns and challenges, and also from kind of the government perspective, be interested in your standpoint.
There's an inclination on the business side to preserve and protect both IP and privacy, given that there is a sense that this is something that the customer base out there highly desires. And so I don't think it should be a surprise that business imperatives suggest limiting access to information without a warrant, for example, warrantless searches. And I'm not a lawyer, so I will leave that to the law enforcement people here to elaborate on. But the key point is that there's a balance. There's a balance between security, both personal and community, and civil liberties and privacy. And striking that balance is no light lift. But I think the business view of this is that excessive efforts on the part of government to access what customer bases believe is private information is not consistent with their business model, number one, and number two, isn't consistent with larger notions of civil liberties and privacy in this country.
So I think the general brings up a good point. Our task is to not only uphold the Constitution, which includes protecting everyone's civil liberties, but also protecting the American people. So I think this is where the conversation starts, and I think the general hit on it, that there's certain things that businesses believe that we are looking to obtain without a warrant, when in fact it is completely the opposite. And so I think this is where the healthy conversations have to have between the private sector and the government, in regards at least to the FBI, that we are not looking to obtain something without a warrant. We are absolutely looking to obtain things with a warrant, and not putting people beyond the law, which is, and so access or a lack of access to certain information, despite the fact that a judge, an independent third party, has so ordered it, is a challenge both on the national security and whether or not it fits within the confines of what our founders laid out in our Constitution. So I think on that premise, it is worthy of continued dialogue to make sure that there is clear articulation of what, at least from the FBI, we are actually seeking to have happen, and what, as importantly, we are not seeking to have happen. And so I do think that technology is altering the way we are doing business, and I mean that writ large, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the public sector, and that our laws need to work to keep pace with what is the impact, and there needs to be interpretation. But it is something that we are gravely concerned about, and making sure that we continue to refine the education, not only on what we are seeking, as I articulated, with the private sector, but also in the judicial process.
Rebecca, I'm going to give you the last word here this afternoon.
Awesome.
Perfect. That's great. This is a very tough issue, and I do think that in some ways technology has outpaced law and policy on it, and there is a need to revisit existing legislative solutions to this problem, because we are in a position where there is, I think, some degree of trust deficit in the government, and we need to be attentive to that and attuned to that. Privacy is obviously a huge priority and concern for members of the public. So is law enforcement's ability to, when necessary and when warranted, literally and figuratively, access communications that contain threat information or crimes. So is that an irresolvable impasse. I don't think it is. I think that if you look back historically, there have been moments like this over time, and the law and policy have caught up to where the technology is. So my hope is that in the near future, we'll achieve one of those.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time this afternoon, the expertise that you provided to this panel discussion. And thank you so much to the audience. You've been a great audience, and thank you for your great questions.
Looking forward to getting together.